Hello. This is a history of French security policy in Africa since the late colonial period until roughly the present. Now, the history of this policy of France's approach to Africa is important for a number of reasons. And the most important reason is that it's necessary context for understanding France's ongoing role in Chad and its current engagement in Sahel. The Franco African relationship remains poorly understood in the English speaking world, and it also remains, I think, a curious feature of international politics. While it's no longer quite neo colonial in the same way that it was perhaps right after the independence of its colonies, it still embodies a very imbalanced power relationship between clients and patrons, or rather, a patron. Uh, Probably the closest parallel I can think of would be the American role in the Middle East, or perhaps parts of Latin America, although, again, it doesn't exactly correspond. Unlike that relationship, though, or those relationships, its origins are resolutely colonial and need to be understood in that context. And even in the early post-colonial years, so from the 1960s to 1970s, the relationship between France and many of its former colonies more closely resembled something like a Soviet relationship with its Eastern Bloc clients than anything else I can think of. It's not a very flattering comparison, but I think it's a fair one. So this raises a number of questions. What are the origins of this relationship? How has it changed over time? Why has it persisted? What impact has it had on African political development? And what can we learn from this? To start things off, I think it's important to go back to the 1950s. So right before most of France's colonies gained their independence. And this is a time when French and African political leaders were negotiating the end of colonial rule, or they definitely saw it on the horizon, and they were kind of uh, attempting to determine how kind of a future independent Africa was going to look like. Now, France had a massive colonial empire in Africa, beginning in the 1880s. I mean, parts of Senegal even before then, lasting again until 1960. This was divided by the end of the colonial period into two major colonial federations, plus Madagascar. So you had French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa. And the debates among African and French political leaders at the time, and between African and French leaders, needs to be said, focused on whether political autonomy and later independence should be devolved to the federations, that is, two big independent or quasi independent countries, or whether power should be devolved into the individual territories, which is eventually what happened. Uh, in the context of the times, French policymakers themselves, for the most part, there are always exceptions, wanted to contain the fallout from the Algerian War, which was going on at the time, and save or preserve their influence, if not control, over their African empire, whether it was going to be called an empire or not. In fact, at the time, it wasn't called the French Empire; it was called the French Union, and later it was called the French Community before these countries became independent. This led to numerous influential French officials under President Charles de Gaulle, specifically after 1958, notably a man named Jacques Foccart, who we'll learn a little bit more about, to really push for devolution of political authority to as many territories as possible. Foccart and others, including de Gaulle, felt that a constellation of weaker territories would guarantee lasting French influence over its former colonies than potentially more powerful territories or federations that would be perhaps more economically viable or politically viable, but would also perhaps prove more resistant to French pressures and influence. At the same time, there are a number of African leaders who felt the same way. Uh, One notable example would be Félix Houphouët-Boigny, who was the leader of Cote d'Ivoire, and uh, Léon Ba, who was the leader of Gabon. And these leaders felt that they would much prefer having smaller territories, particularly wealthier territories like Cote d'Ivoire and Gabon, who didn't want to share their wealth with their neighbors, uh, would prefer smaller territories in which local elites could consolidate their rule and their power and benefit from their relationship or patron or client patron relationship with France in ways that they might not be able to benefit if they were kind of subsumed into larger territories. And this went for some poorer territories as well, where local political elites felt they would benefit from consolidating their power over smaller territories, in which they would be kind of big fish in a small pond rather than being small fish in a big pond. So this kind of combination of forces, so French French pushes and African kind of African interests combined to result in a political map in 1960, which looked uh, like the political map we see today. That is, you see uh, a number of 12 or 14 different African countries, apart from the English former English British colonies like Nigeria or Ghana or Gambia, which are divided into their constituent territories. Um, it would be intriguing to kind of think about what an alternative Africa may have resulted had independence occurred uh, basically with two countries. So the French West Africa as a country and the French Equatorial Africa as a country. And there was a moment in 1958 when that seemed like a real possibility. Who knows what would have happened if that had occurred? Now, France had more or less gotten what it wanted, with the exception of the country of Guinea, which rejected the new French constitution and was expelled essentially from the French community and stripped of all its connections to France and kind of left adrift. We won't talk about Guinea, but if you're more interested in the history of the Franco-African relationship, Guinea was for a long time a kind of uh, stone in the shoe of French policymakers for quite a while. Now, we need to talk a little bit about this guy, Jacques Foccart. He has a reputation in France and especially in vast parts of Africa of being kind of the puppet master and manipulator of all of African French policy, or all of France's African policy. The man who controlled all of France's ministries, all of their intelligence services, even their kind of security policy in Africa after decolonization. Now, this view is, I think, largely exaggerated. But it is important to note that Foccart was the point person, the man in charge of African affairs under the presidencies of Charles de Gaulle and Georges Pompidou. So this goes from 1958, 1959 until 1974 when Georges Pompidou dies. And this is important because this is a time period in which many historians, including myself, consider to be the kind of first or put another way, it was sort of the period of pure neocolonialism. It's not a word that I like very much because I think it often obscures more than it reveals, and also can be very polemical. But this is a time in which France really did exercise an enormous amount of control and influence over its former colonies in very direct ways. And Foccart wanted to. He was in many ways the architect, or at least sat at the circle of a network of individuals who were the architects collectively of developing France's security architecture in Africa in such a way as to maintain French influence over as much of the continent as possible, or rather over its former colonies, in as deep and kind of powerful a way as they could conceivably imagine, and sustainably as they could imagine. So Foccart and his colleagues developed a multi-tiered approach to this kind of the development of this kind of security architecture, and this revolved around the first of all the stationing of a number of or the creation of or the extension of a number of French military bases across the former empire, which remain in place. In some cases, remain in place to this day, particularly in colonies like Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Gabon, and Chad. And these are supposed to be kind of support points, not only for interventions in neighboring states, but also to act as a deterrent against any kind of local uprising, or, as the French like to term it, subversion from the outside. And of course, the subversion they were most concerned about was communism, uh, to which they dedicated enormous resources to try to counter. Although it has to be said that subsequent historiography has really kind of uh, made it clear that the actual threat from any kind of communist movement or any kind of effort from the Soviet Union or its allies to undermine French influence in its former empire was actually quite marginal. French intelligence services and politicians and policymakers tended to exaggerate any kind of or paint any kind of opposition to client or allied regimes as communists, regardless of whether they actually had any connection to the Soviet Union or not. And you often see this in French intelligence reports at the time, where all sorts of people and individuals and movements are considered to be communist and uh, posing existential threats not only to various countries but also to France's position in Africa, when in fact it was a collection of a handful of university students who had in fact even rejected Marxism. So the point I want to make here is that the French construed threats to their empire or former empire in rather exaggerated terms, and this would continue until at least the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and would embrace a number of different so-called threats who perhaps posed less of a threat than the French feared. That being said, though, the presence of all these military bases across the continent certainly deterred coup attempts. They also helped to deter rebellions, and they also reassured their local allies and clients that France would back them up in case of emergency or in case they were needed. And one more thing: the positioning of French units throughout the continent also served the purpose of protecting France's rather large expatriate population who lived throughout its former empire until this day. But particularly in the 1960s and 70s, this amounted to several hundred thousand people. So, if in any case, in any situation of political instability, it would have been very important for French policymakers to be able to intervene to ensure that their citizens were safe. And that is a non-negligible factor in trying to understand the France's military posture in Africa, at least historically speaking. Another aspect of their security posture was a real investment in the security services of all these different countries. So the police and intelligence services of virtually every former French colony was uh, established by, staffed by, and oftentimes led by serving French officers, either intelligence officers or French military officers. And this was true into the 1970s. So you effectively had intelligence services that were local franchises of France's main overseas intelligence service, the SDEC, going well into the 1970s before they managed to develop a degree of operational autonomy from France and escape kind of from the oversight of their French handlers. So this not only, of course, provided France's overseas intelligence agency SDEC with a massive kind of regional network, but also provided France with a very substantial stake in the nature of state consolidation in these former colonies. Related to that was not only the presence of French military bases, but the large presence of French military advisors within African militaries. So France took upon itself the training, the equipment, training, equipping, arming, supplying the new militaries of all the new independent states, and most of them had also signed defense or military assistance agreements with France, in which France agreed to provide staffing at all levels, down to sometimes, for example, in the Chadian military, down to platoon level of officers who would serve as both advisors, but also at times serve in command roles, until the local officer corps would be brought up to a situation in which they could functionally run the militaries themselves. At least that was sort of the French idea. This again would last until the mid 1970s or even until the 1980s. So you have not only security services but a military that are essentially still remain in the hands of France into the 1970s. And then along with that, there was a major French commitment, although it was never formalized, to intervene militarily in pretty much anywhere that they thought was necessary to maintain the political stability, i.e., the political longevity of their most reliable clients. Now, in some cases, this was formalized in a series of defense agreements. There were 5 or 6 countries that signed formal defense agreements with France that actually had secret clauses that called for French involvement in the internal maintenance of order, in which French general would take over the local military and they would essentially be, and French resources would essentially be used to suppress insurrections or uprisings. Now, it turns out that Chad is the only country where this defense agreement actually had to be activated. And we'll talk more about that at a later seminar. But there have been some interesting econometric studies done since the 1990s on the actual influence of French military guarantees to African clients during the Cold War period. And it seems as though, now whether you can trace this to the French military guarantee or to other factors, is, I guess, it's an open question. But former French colonies experienced far fewer civil wars on average from 1960 until 1991 than any other part of the continent. And this is often ascribed to the deterrent role that French forces played in these countries, and the assumed role that France would take if any internal "quote unquote" subversive movement would attempt to challenge the existing political order. Now, that didn't prevent military coups. There were a number of military coups, especially in the 60s and 70s, like they were all over the continent. But France's position on these were, if it was not a core colonial territory, such as Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire, which were a bit wealthier and had much closer connections to France, or if, as long as the people that took power in countries that had coups were proved reliable partners to France and didn't challenge the relationship between France and its former colonies, then France oftentimes would not object. Although it was very much a case by case basis. For example, in Gabon in 1964, there was a coup attempt against Léon Bas, and French forces intervened immediately to reverse the coup. And there were a number of other instances in which France threatened to do that, and that resulted in a return to power of the original president or leader. Now, at the same time, France has been and remains the most interventionist foreign power in Africa since 1960. There have been roughly, again, depending on how you count or how you define a military intervention, there have been roughly 50 military interventions or 50 French military interventions in Africa since 1960. And on the screen, you can see a list of some of the major ones. These are ones which included were essentially expeditionary forces, or at least several hundred or several thousand troops who intervened to protect local regimes and to stabilize local regimes against domestic insurrections or outside invasions, and to protect local political orders. Other interventions outside of these often were smaller or shorter and aimed to either protect French citizens or evacuate foreign nationals, or were part of broader peacekeeping efforts. Now, I won't get too much into Chad because we're going to spend 2 seminars on French interventions in Chad. So I just want to kind of highlight that Chad does, in a lot of ways, epitomize the nature of French interventionism on the continent. And these rationales for intervention shift over time, but it needs to be said that almost all of France's major interventions have served to preserve existing political orders against disruptive threats, oftentimes portrayed as being external threats. And it also needs to be said that French officials and policymakers have, even since the 1960s, been very clear that they don't consider the existing political orders to be perfect in any way or even ideal, but they consider them to be far preferable to whatever kind of chaos or instability would result if they were overthrown or overturned. Now, this did lead to, and it needs to be, I think, emphasized that until the end of the Cold War, when kind of international norms about governance started to shift, France was explicitly a partisan of one-party regimes in Africa, which is a bit curious because, as far as I can tell, it's the only Western power to explicitly promote one-party dictatorships or authoritarian regimes in areas outside of the industrialized world. The United States, even though they, of course, supported many dictatorships during the Cold War, sometimes to extremes, as far as I know, they didn't. This wasn't an explicit part of policy to promote the consolidation of dictatorships overseas. Well, the French were very explicit about their desire to promote dictatorships in Africa. They felt that single-party states were more effective than multi-party states. Multi-party states were inherently insecure. Also, military dictatorships at least brought the discipline of the military to governance, and this was far preferable to alternatives in which either communists could take power or some kind of radical democratic movement that would devolve power to potentially anti-French elements in the country. So France was always on the side of the authoritarians until, as I said, the 1990s, when norms started to shift. And this would, as I will discuss, have some lasting effects on the political trajectories of a number of African states. Chad being one of them, in that every French intervention in Chad and French military commitment to Chad to the present day has aimed at bolstering authoritarian political orders against any kind of challenge, regardless of what that challenge was or has been, and that remains the case. But we'll get more into that later. Um, and I should add that Operation Barkhane, the ongoing French intervention, has a similar logic in the sense that although it is mainly or principally a counter-terrorist operation, uh, its ultimate political goal is to maintain political stability. That is the political continuity of regimes throughout the Sahel, and to ensure that any challenges to that kind of political order happen through very specific and controlled channels, i.e., through elections. And regardless of how problematic those elections may be, that is the political order that France is aiming to protect. And obviously, they see jihadism as being a major, if not the major, threat to that situation. And there's a consistent fear that if a lot of these countries, or even one of these countries, ends up being too destabilized by the threat of jihadism, that it will have a domino effect. And many policymakers will have seen um, uh, current events in the Sahel as kind of proof of this assumption. I won't get quite into that until I won't get much into that until a bit later, though. Um, Now, there have been patterns of French interventions that are consistent over time, and I should say that the French relationship with its former colonies has changed quite a bit since 1960. But there are continuities, and as a historian, I love looking for continuities. What has what has stayed the same over time, even as kind of at the surface level things seem to have changed quite a bit. And although the French relationship with its former colonies can no longer, I think, be described as neocolonial, African countries are far more independent internationally, or at least have far more international options in terms of their relationships than they did in the 1960s. There are still patterns that remain in place, and especially in the French relationship and in French policy. Now, there are a number of these patterns I think have that both relate to French decision making and the French interventions themselves, but also in the impact they have had on the political evolutions of the countries in which France intervenes. So, uh, French interventions have since 1960 uh, been construed in very ideological terms, and they privilege sort of grand narratives over local agency. So the political analysis that governs French decision making, and I should say this probably isn't just limited to France, but the political analysis that governs French decision making has largely focused on rather simplistic prisms of analysis, arguing that either, if you go back to the Cold War, either there's some kind of communist threat to French clients that could prove massively destabilizing in a regional way, or that that regional powers are promoting subversion. So Libya was a constant target of French interventions, for example. Um, and or that even the Americans or the British are posing threats to French influence in their former empire, which was a major motivator of some French interventions well into the 1990s. Um, Another aspect of these interventions is that because of France's desire to maintain influence and uh, credibility as a partner in within its former empire, this means that there is a conflation of French interest and those of different African elites who may call on French support. And this gives African elites a lot of influence over French policymaking. And this has historically been the case from the 60s to the present, where uh, African elites are often consulted on French actions, and the French are very concerned about how different African elites view the French response to different crises. And this kind of flies in the face of this idea that this kind of relationship is a one-way street, that France is the sole dominating partner, and that it kind of controls what's going on. France has often been very concerned about at least the seeming legality of what they're doing, and in order to make sure that whatever actions they conduct are at least legal on the surface or conform to certain accords they've signed, it's important that African elites give their assent. And it's also important to maintain French credibility and French legitimacy as a partner to a number of their other client states on the continent. So African elites are and have remained an important partner in French interventionist policies. So in a lot of ways, you could consider this kind of Franco-African relationship to be a joint project. This is not simply a project of France kind of imposing itself overseas. It's also a project of local elites who see themselves as being or see France as being a potentially powerful partner in helping to consolidate their own authority, or as a potentially powerful patron to allow them to kind of expand their power and influence. So, just talk a little bit more about this idea of neocolonialism. Again, I think the word is very appropriate to explain the French relationship with its clients until the 70s. Um, this is a time in which the French market share, for instance, in its former colonies was around 80%, in which French, as I said, France dominated security services and the military, in which French advisors staffed African executives, and in which French economic interests dominated African economies. Um, these elements have really shifted over time and are no longer as dominant as they used to be. So, uh, for instance, in the first 20 years of the independence era, French exports to the CFA zone declined from 6% to 3%. Um, the By 1980, Africa was no longer a major trade partner to France, and in fact, the most important African countries for French trade were Nigeria and South Africa, neither of which were former colonies, and that remains true to today. So France's most important partners on economic partners in Africa are Nigeria and South Africa, and those are not countries that France has ever been involved with militarily or in any kind of security sense. So it's hard to argue that France's security policy is driven by directly by any kind of economic interest, or even kind of indirectly by economic elites. So today, for instance, from 2005 to 2015, French trade is less than 3% of exports and 2% of imports for the whole continent. Um, I don't have the latest data, but in 2015, France's market share in the CFA zone is just 11.4%. I think it's less today. And the latest, so it goes back a while, unfortunately, but the last foreign investment data I managed to find shows that of a direct investment stock of over €1 trillion in 2014, only 43 billion were invested all of sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm not quite sure how that's distributed, but I think a large proportion of that is actually in Nigeria and South Africa as well. So the point I want to get is that France is not gaining major economic benefits from its interventions. And in fact, Operation Barkhane costs far more than the returns on investments in Mali or Niger, despite the fact that Niger is an important supplier of French uranium. So this is not something that can be directly attributed to uh, economic needs or the power of capitalist elites, as some critics often point out. Now, one element of French policy that deserves to be highlighted is the way in which what I would call grand narratives tend to dominate the political analysis that French policymakers make of the political problems facing their clients. So during the Cold War, of course, and France wasn't the only country doing this, the fear of communism was seen as the biggest threat to their interests, and any kind of threat to local allies was painted in terms of communism. I already discussed this. Um, there was also a threat that I think was probably more legitimate, and that was the threat of Libyan expansion. So Muammar Gaddafi was the leader of Libya from 1969 until 2011, and from the 1970s into the 1980s, he made some real efforts to overthrow the regimes of a number of African countries and or to develop close relationships with the leaderships of a number of African countries. And because of his oil resources, he had a lot of money in which to do so. And at the same time, he used that money to buy uh, substantial amounts of arms from both the Soviet Union and, I should add, France, uh, as a way to not just build up the Libyan military, but also to then serve as kind of a re-export center to exert influence over other states. And it was Gaddafi's effort to kind of try to punch above his weight in the international sphere, and also to try to establish his influence over sub-Saharan Africa. And France was continually not just irritated by Gaddafi's efforts to undermine French influence in its former colonies, but this actually led to several direct military interventions, especially in Chad, which borders Libya, and in which Gaddafi had for 20 years annexed some territory, and continually supported or sponsored a number of guerrilla movements aiming to unseat French-supported clients. Uh, Another, I think, underestimated element of these French grand narratives, especially I think among English speakers, is this continual fear you have from the 1960s. Well, it goes back to the French colonial era of so-called Anglo-Saxon imperialism. The French use the term Anglo-Saxon to describe the British and the Americans, and it is not a friendly term. It is a pejorative term, and it refers not only to American policy and American culture, but alleged American and British designs over French interests and the an American or British plot to undermine and destroy French interests in Africa. And this was a huge element of French political and strategic thinking from the 1960s to the 1990s, even after the Cold War ended. There was a real fear that the United States was making active efforts to undermine French control over its former colonies. And it's interesting because subsequent historiography, going through American archives and interviewing American policymakers and kind of looking through the declassified record, makes it pretty clear that the American policymakers throughout much of this time were actually quite happy that the French were playing this role in its former colonies, because this meant that the United States didn't have to exert resources to protect in quotation marks, depending on your point of view, um, a huge chunk of Africa from alleged communist expansion or from the Cold War. So they were actually quite content to have the French act as regional guarantors of stability. But the French didn't really understand that this was actually the American position for the most part. So there were fears that the Americans were involved in subverting their rule or their influence, and this would tragically take its most extreme form during the Rwandan Civil War and later genocide, in which France's intervention in 1990 in Rwanda was largely motivated by fears that the Rwanda Patriotic Front was a cat's paw of Anglo-Saxon imperialism. And you read this in declassified documents of French decision making from 1990, and it seems baffling today. But this is something that they well and truly believed. I think it's less powerful today. I don't think although the French are always suspicious of the Americans, the French are always suspicious of American objectives and American power. Uh, I think they have a much more realistic appreciation of the American role. But it might be good to keep that in mind, that because of the suspicion of American motives and American intentions, this has had an impact on French African policy in the past. So uh, this kind of emphasis on major threats to the exclusion of kind of efforts to understand the local drivers of instability continues to this day. I think it's not just limited to the French, unfortunately. For example, the current French Revue Stratégique de Défense et Sécurité Nationale, which would sort of be like their national security strategy, uh, emphasizes the main risk in the Sahel as of jihadist groups taking root in the Sahel, and therefore then expanding their presence. This as a lot of observers and commentators and regional experts have kind of pointed out, really underplays local drivers of conflict under the sweeping jargon of issues of governance or the external threat of jihadists, rather than kind of emphasizing the local drivers of not just conflict, but also the expansion of jihadism as a political factor. Um, French officials have painted this kind of picture of a terrorist arc, which connects all these jihadist groups together, from Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb all the way to Al Shabaab, and the fears of creating a terrorist state at the gates of Europe. And here, descriptions of this from the mouths of French policymakers. It's there does seem to be a consistent lack of, I don't want to say a lack of understanding, but I think there is a lack of effort to try to understand the local motivators of driving conflict and challenges to state authority as being perhaps something more than just jihadist infiltration. And this has a lot of echoes in past kind of French uh, perceptions of threats to their position on the continent, of general destabilization of security, or climate of instability that threatens their position, um, either being controlled from communists on the outside, or Libya, or even the United States. So in this case, France's France's ongoing kind of involvement in the Sahel is accompanied by a sort of language and understanding of regional conflicts that is very focused on the jihadism and less on the role of, for example, local states in marginalizing communities, which then take root as guerrilla movements. And jihadist groups are not understood as guerrilla movements per se; they're understood as terrorist groups, which, while true in a very narrow sense, obfuscates a little bit actual um, their actual role as insurgent and guerrilla groups that act as guerrilla groups act in other parts of the world, whether they're jihadists or not. And that is a potential flaw in their overall policy. Is their lack of real effort to understand the local drivers of conflict. Now, I already talked a bit about this. African elites playing a major role in French policymaking and French decision making. Um, and this continues to this day. Uh, Even Emmanuel Macron, the French president, got a lot of flack for his alleged convocation of African leaders to POW, not quite alleged, in January, in which he demanded that a number of African presidents fly to France to openly state their support for France's continued role in the Sahel. That is a throwback to the 1960s or 70s, and that didn't look great for France. But it did force a lot of African leaders to put their cards on the table and to reinforce and solidify their commitments to having France present as guarantors of their respective regimes. Now, um, at the same time, behind the scenes, the French are very careful to try and not trample on the sovereignty or responsibilities of their African partners, at least on the surface. And this is fine and great, and obviously it's important that France not be seen to act as a neo-colonial power. But the flip side of the coin is that this means that French officials are very reticent to overtly criticize, um, for example, major abuses committed by local state security services, which are arguably one of the major drivers of conflict in the Sahel, and abuses by the state and active efforts by state elites to marginalize communities in their own countries, like the Fulani or the Tuareg. And this leads to a sort of legitimation of local political orders that are themselves drivers of conflict to begin with. So this is not new. This is something that France has been doing since the 60s, but it needs to be taken into consideration. The French policy in the Sahel is not wholly French. It is also partly a product of African elite pressure. So we could talk a lot about historical examples. It might not be worth going into too much detail, but um, kind of examples of the way that African elites have shaped decision making. A really famous one would have been the Shaba Wars. So this is so Shaba is now called Katanga in Congo, but the leader of Zaire at the time, so the name of Congo at the time was Zaire, Mobutu. He continually fed French diplomats and military officials with sort of fake intelligence reports about uh, Cuban and Soviet efforts to subvert his regime, and French officials accepted these reports uncritically and used these as a justification to intervene to protect Mobutu in 1977, 1978. And so Mobutu sort of manipulated French fears in ways that that led to a positive French response to guarantee his regime's survival. Um, in Chad, sort of the same or a similar dynamic occurred in which requests from multiple African partners, multiple African leaders, especially Senghor in Senegal and Houphouët-Boigny in Cote d'Ivoire and Bongo in Gabon, pushed France to intervene in cases where otherwise it might not have, in order to maintain its credibility with its partners. Um, and Rwanda is probably the most tragic case in which France intervened, not only because they were afraid of American imperialism, but also because they felt that if they didn't intervene to protect Habyarimana, the leader of Rwanda, that France would lose credibility as a partner with its other African allies. And oftentimes, in the memoirs of French officials or French presidents, and as well as in declassified records, you constantly see veiled threats from African leaders to go and find another partner if France doesn't come to their aid. And the French took this threat very seriously, and they would often, in fact, come to their aid if attacked. Um, so there have been, I think, some long-term consequences of this French engagement. So the French military, as the military of a highly industrialized, wealthy country, has been and is well suited to fighting against lightly armed and comparatively disorganized forces. Um, that's not the problem. The French army is comparatively well equipped, extremely well trained, and they're when it comes to actual combat, they're generally going to win. But these short-term successes have come at longer-term costs. The security guarantee that France has provided to numerous African allies has encouraged the worst behavior out of these regimes. And this behavior, which often consists of abusive taxation or marginalization of different ethnic communities, or massive amounts of corruption, this behavior often is responsible for the problems that the instability these regimes often face to begin with. So French guarantees actually encourage long-term processes which lead to destabilization that France is then called upon to solve. Um, Also, French security guarantees discourage reforms. And French interventions have in the past prolonged civil wars. And Chad is a great example of this. Rwanda is another example of this. And paradoxically, because of the kind of uh, uh, well, the kind of guarantee that they provided different African allies, this has led to complacency among a number of different African heads of state about the kind of threats they face, and has led to state collapse. And Chad is a good example of this. Mali actually recently is an interesting example in the sense that the presence of a large French military, the large French military presence in Mali, has not dissuaded coup plotters from overthrowing the government. And while this hasn't led to state collapse and may in fact have more positive consequences, although I doubt it. This does suggest that the presence of French troops and the security guarantee they imply does not necessarily lead to the kind of political outcomes that leaders that rely on them are hoping to benefit from. So, just a couple of examples. In Zaire, France intervened. They saved Mobutu, who remained dictator for another 20 years and pillaged his own country, and that Mobutu's governance style was directly responsible for the sheer bloodiness of the wars that Zaire would subsequently face after the Rwandan genocide. In Chad, several interventions to save local regimes, which often prolonged wars or led to state collapse. In the Central African Republic, France has also intervened many times, and it's although I think their intervention in 2013 saved large numbers of lives. I think that needs to be stated. The French intervention, the Sangalis, saved potentially thousands or tens of thousands of lives. The situation in which they intervene is only explicable with reference to the role that France played as a not just as a guarantor of security, but also as a co-partner in governance well into the 1990s, which encouraged the ethnicization of politics and the marginalization of the northern part of CAR, and has engendered a number of conflicts which continue to this day. Rwanda is, of course, the extreme example of the negative impact of France's role on the continent. But even Cote d'Ivoire, in which an intervention in 2002, which aimed to reverse a coup and actually almost certainly saved hundreds or even thousands of lives, it ended up establishing a de facto partition of Cote d'Ivoire and prolonged a civil war. Um, and France's kind of confused response to that conflict obviously made it worse. So, just a quick note on current perspectives today. So, Barkhane, like its predecessors, as I said, has a similar goal to maintaining or restoring rather stability that the Sahel had uh, benefited from, at least in some respects, from the 1990s onwards. Uh, and the as I noted, the strategic thinking behind French policy still follows this kind of grand narrative approach that doesn't that ignores either deliberately or not local drivers of conflict, and it underemphasizes the role that regional states have played in generating these conflicts. So, what kind of lessons can be drawn here? There are a number of negative lessons, but it's always easier to be critical than it is to kind of develop alternatives. But um, it's important to note that the role of African political elites continue to play a really important role in French policymaking. In Chad specifically, the French have really bolstered Debby's rule, and Deby is probably the most dictatorial of any leader in the Sahel, the most authoritarian, and runs the state with the most effective, but also probably the most brutal security service in the region. And France relies heavily on Deby for the regional security policy, and this kind of while France sees their role as a stabilizing role, it is important to emphasize, I think, that Chad is not stable in the sense that any outside observer might mean by the word stable. Violence is endemic. There's economic pressures threatening the regime. The human rights record of the regime is terrible. There are a number of kind of low level rebellions. There's been at least one major coup attempt in the past 2 or 3 years, which France put down. It's unclear how the kind of trajectory is going to follow, but the fact that France is providing an effective guarantee to Deby's regime does mean that Deby has few incentives to try to broaden his base in a way that could um, could improve the situation for the majority of Chadians. So in this sense, France's aims depend on the long-term viability of the dictator, whose very policies are essentially destabilizing. And when Deby leaves the scene, whether it's due to his alleged health problems, which have been rumors about his health problems for 30 years, or for other reasons, it's unclear what happens after that, and France may be left holding a rotten basket. Um, and if Chad implodes after Deby goes, I think France will bear some responsibility for the consequences. So it's I think more broadly speaking, in terms of French security guarantees or quasi guarantees or French military assistance in general, it's unclear to me, given the history of the French role, not just in the Sahel but more broadly in the continent, whether the French military presence or even military assistance can actually act as a stabilizing role, or whether in the longer term it just translates into more capable oppressors. This has been the case in a number of African countries, and I hope it doesn't. This is not one of the legacies of Barkhane today, but only the future can tell. And as a historian, I am only good at predicting the past, so I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future. So, Thank you for listening, and the next seminar will be on more specifically focused on Chad, and we'll look at the history of Chad until its independence in 1960. So thanks for listening, and have a good day.